In Millbrook County, when Caleb Voss began hauling abandoned beehives onto his father's old flatbed truck, most assumed he was simply clearing out forgotten debris. No one questioned it. Decaying hive boxes lined the back of half the barns across the valley, piled carelessly and left to rot. Some were riddled with wax moths, others collapsed under years of weather damage. Caleb had asked 3 different farms if he could take their unwanted hives, and each one agreed without hesitation. Who would want a stack of lifeless, deteriorating beehives? But when he approached a 4th and a 5th farm, curiosity crept in. By the time the snow melted off Miller's Ridge that spring, 17-year-old Caleb had gathered more than 40 abandoned hives, arranging them in straight rows behind the family's equipment shed. He was building something visible, yet no one could fathom what exactly he was constructing. Over dinner one evening, his mother asked what purpose he envisioned for a shed full of dead bee boxes. He simply shrugged and replied, "I'm still figuring it out." That wasn't an answer, but it was the only one he offered for a long time. If determination, rural innovation, and ordinary individuals achieving the extraordinary resonate with you, subscribe and follow along weekly for more stories. Before moving forward, share in the comments where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how these tales reach listeners everywhere. Millbrook County was the kind of place where everyone's affairs became everyone else's business, whether they embraced it or not. Nestled in a shallow valley 2 hours from the nearest interstate, it was surrounded by dairy farms, hay fields, and orchards passed down through 3 or 4 generations. The Voss family tended 40 acres of mixed pasture and crops, nothing elaborate. Their survival depended on thrift and long days rather than scale. Caleb had grown up rising before dawn and working late into the evenings. Like most valley kids, he didn't draw attention. Quiet, observant, the sort of teenager who preferred watching mechanisms in motion to discussing them. His grades were acceptable. His attendance was fine. Nothing about him hinted at ambition, not the kind adults recognized anyway. Yet one day he began asking questions about bees. It started small. At the feed store, he struck up a conversation with Harlan Petrie, an elderly man who once kept hives before arthritis weakened his hands. Caleb's questions went beyond idle curiosity. He probed about ventilation, why colonies sometimes perished overnight, and what it meant when bees stopped foraging. Harlan, flattered that someone under 60 cared, spoke for nearly an hour. Then Caleb began collecting. Each farm had its tale of abandonment. Old man Doyler's hives had collapsed 2 winters prior, and he never mustered the courage to try again. The Ray's family had lost 3 colonies to colony collapse disorder, a baffling phenomenon where worker bees simply vanish, leaving a queen, some brood, and untouched honey with no clear cause. Other hives suffered from wood rot or raccoon raids targeting larvae. All were deemed useless. One of the Ray's hives proved salvageable, becoming one of Caleb's first successes. Proof that a colony dismissed as lost might still hold value. Caleb didn't believe they were worthless. He just didn't voice his reasons yet. The shed filled before his activities drew much attention. His friend Dylan asked him outright one afternoon while repairing a fence, "You're not really trying to start a bee farm with junk boxes, are you?" "Working on it," Caleb said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got right now." Dylan let it drop. Mostly because Caleb had that familiar look when he'd already decided, and arguing wouldn't sway him. What no one knew was that Caleb was chasing an idea he couldn't fully articulate, slowly crystallizing in a battered spiral notebook hidden in his jacket pocket. Pages brimmed with sketches, measurements, notes from library books on apiculture, county extension printouts, and a list of questions for Walt Iverson, the valley's sole man who might hold the answers. Walt, 74, a retired commercial beekeeper who'd once managed nearly 200 colonies before his hands failed and his wife insisted he slow down, lived alone on the town's edge in a lilac-shrouded house cluttered with rusted equipment. Most valley kids avoided him, unwilling to face his sharp tongue. Caleb arrived on a Saturday morning, notebook in hand, with a question gnawing at him for weeks. Could a dead-out hive be revived using bees from a healthy colony? Walt studied him silently before speaking. "Depends what killed it," he said, motioning him inside. That marked the start of something neither expected. Over the following weeks, Walt became both mentor and skeptic, challenging Caleb at every turn. He taught him to read a hive's health like a book, noting the brood pattern. A tight spiral of eggs, larvae, and capped cells signaled a robust, well-mated queen. A patchy, scattered pattern hinted at a failing queen or disease. Most hive deaths, Walt explained, stemmed from neglect. Poor summer ventilation cooked colonies from within. Inadequate winter insulation starved them before spring arrived. People would stack a super, walk away, and wonder why the bees perished. Bees don't fail. People fail bees. That phrase lingered with Caleb long after that spring. Lessons weren't always easy. His first requeening attempt, a new queen introduced too quickly, ended in the colony, killing her within a day. "You rushed it," Walt said bluntly. "Bees don't care how eager you are. You cage her, let them acclimate to her pheromones over days, then release her gradually." Caleb rebuilt his strategy around patience, a virtue that didn't come naturally to a teenager eager to prove himself. He began small, converting 3 of the sturdiest salvaged hives into functional colonies, using bees from a nucleus supplier 2 counties over, small starter colonies with young mated queens and pre-drawn comb frames. It wasn't glamorous work. It involved patching rotted wood, replacing wax moth-damaged frames, and torch to sanitize old boxes, a ritual Walt swore by for equipment with questionable histories. By early summer, those first 3 hives hummed with activity. Caleb learned to distinguish the sound of a healthy colony, a steady, low thrum that shifted pitch if something was amiss. He mastered identifying swarm cells, those peanut-shaped structures bees build when preparing to split the colony, and understood nectar flow, the seasonal windows when flowering plants provided enough sweetness for honey surplus. He mapped forage zones, clover along the county road, wild blackberry thickets on the Petrie property, basswood trees nobody noticed but bees adored. Gradually, without realizing it, he absorbed the valley's ecosystem through the eyes of its most overlooked inhabitants. News spread through the community. Some mocked him. Older farmers joked the Voss kid had lost his mind meddling with bees when real work awaited. His uncle half-seriously wondered if Caleb needed professional help. His father, commendably, remained quiet, letting him labor. Others, however, grew intrigued. Mrs. The Alders, who ran the elementary school garden club, began asking questions as Caleb transported frames through town. Harlan Petrie started visiting just to inspect the hives, nodding approvingly at things he couldn't name. Even Dylan joined weekends, enduring stings without complaint about the smoker's acrid smoke. The turning point came in late July during the valley's worst heat wave in a decade. While several established operations lost colonies to heat stress, Caleb's hives thrived. He'd raised stands with extra ventilation gaps and painted boxes light colors, techniques Walt taught after decades of trial and error. That success silenced doubters more effectively than any explanation. By late July, Caleb had split 2 strong colonies and added more rebuilds from salvage stock, surpassing a dozen working hives. Expansion stemmed from careful management as much as fortune. Healthy colonies often raised new queens and divided naturally, and Walt showed him how to harness that tendency rather than lose bees to swarming. Summer tested him again. In early August, Caleb noticed a sickly sluggishness in one hive, a colony he'd particularly cherished among his first rescued successes. Fewer bees foraged, and those that returned lacked pollen. When he pulled a frame, his stomach sank. Instead of a uniform brood pattern, he found scattered, irregular cells, some capped and sunken rather than smooth and dome-shaped. He raced to Walt, with the frame wrapped in a damp towel. Walt examined it under a lamp for what felt like an eternity before speaking. "Could be a few things," he said. "A failing queen depleting her sperm reserves, or foul brood, a bacterial disease that could devastate an entire apiary. If it's foul brood, we burn this box before it spreads to all your hives." Caleb's throat tightened, weeks of effort potentially erased by an invisible threat. They tested for foul brood first using a field kit Walt kept in his truck. The result was negative. The culprit, they decided, was an aging queen 2 or 3 years old, naturally declining. "This is what nobody mentions when they romanticize beekeeping," Walt said, snapping the test kit shut. "It's not about the bees most days. It's about spotting trouble early enough to act." Caleb recued the hive slowly, precisely as Walt had instructed. Within 10 days, the brood pattern tightened and foraging resumed seamlessly. A minor crisis in the grand scheme, yet it taught him a lesson harder than any triumph. A thriving hive isn't a finished project. It demands constant vigilance, season after season. By August, Caleb managed 15 working colonies, all rebuilt from equipment deemed worthless. He harvested his first meaningful honey crop that month, using Walt's borrowed extractor until dusk, watching golden honey spiral downward in the tank. It wasn't lucrative. A few £100 sold at the farmer's market in mason jars labeled with hand-lettered tags. Yet it wasn't about profit. By fall, orchard owners began asking a question nobody anticipated. Could his bees pollinate their trees next spring? 2 local apple orchards had struggled with poor fruit set for years, likely tied to declining wild pollinators. Caleb had suspected this himself, scribbling half-formed theories in his notebook. Now he had confirmation. He'd created a dependable local source of healthy pollinators, relocatable to orchards during bloom, then returning to pasture or forest edges for the rest of the year. It wasn't his original plan. It was sharper, refined by experience. He'd set out not just to keep bees, but to restore something the valley had quietly lost, a functioning pollination network built from discarded hive boxes. Winter arrived quietly without fanfare. Cold, patient waiting. Walt had warned that more colonies die in winter than any other season, not from freezing but starvation and moisture issues. Bees don't hibernate. They cluster, vibrating muscles to generate heat, slowly consuming honey. A hive with insufficient reserves or trapped condensation dripping into the cluster perishes unnoticed by February. In November, Caleb meticulously inspected each colony, weighing honey stores by hand, adding insulation wraps, and cutting upper entrances to shed moisture. He mounted mouse guards on every entrance, knowing a frozen hive invites rodents seeking warmth. Then he waited. He checked weekly, brushing snow from entrances and pressing his ear to the hives, listening for that low, steady hum meaning the cluster lived. Silence terrified him more than any disease. But when March's first warmth coaxed him to pry open a box, he found the colony intact, smaller, having endured a harsh season, yet alive, the queen already laying a fresh ring of eggs. Every hive survived. Walt, who'd lost colonies most winters despite meticulous care, admitted it was among the best survival rates he'd witnessed from a first-year operation. That same spring, once buds appeared, Caleb moved 8 of his strongest hives to the Dueler orchard for bloom season. The same farm that had abandoned beekeeping after its own colonies failed years earlier. Old Man Dueler watched the delivery silently, arms crossed. He visited the Voss property occasionally that winter, asking brief questions about hive conditions before departing. Curiosity, rare as it was, flickered in his gaze. 6 weeks later, Dueler stood among branches heavy with young apples, some requiring support. He hadn't seen fruit set like this in over a decade. He drove to the Voss place that afternoon, found Caleb repairing a hive stand, and stood still for a long moment. "Didn't think much of what you were doing with those old boxes," he said. "I know," Caleb replied, chuckling. "Wasn't sure I did either, honestly." Dueler nodded, staring at the shed brimming with hives that had once faced the burned pile, the nearest thing to an apology he'd ever offer. Glad someone in this valley was paying attention. By the following year, Caleb managed nearly 30 colonies and secured pollination contracts with 3 local orchards each spring. Harlan Petrie visited weekends, lingering to chat bees, something the old man later admitted gave him purpose he hadn't felt in years. Walt never stopped offering corrections, though they grew fewer and less frequent as seasons passed. The valley didn't transform overnight, yet something shifted in how people viewed discarded equipment. A neglected hive ceased being trash, became potential. A quiet, unremarkable teenager became someone a few began to admire. What Caleb built wasn't flashy. It wasn't an empire, nor an overnight windfall. It was a modest, patient system of restored hives, healthy colonies, and improved harvests. Proof that most the valley dismissed as worthless simply needed someone willing to look closer and ask why instead of assuming they already knew. He still carries that spiral notebook, now filled with 3 years of notes instead of a few sketches. Every spring, as orchards bloom and his bees hum fills the valley air, more people recall why they once doubted him, and why they no longer do. If you've ever cultivated bees, planted gardens for pollinators, or toiled on land others dismissed, share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear it. And if this resonated, subscribe for more tales of ordinary people crafting extraordinary legacies from overlooked fragments.